So we obviously talked first about research questions and hypotheses, the idea of once you have your logic model, coming up with a outcomes of interest and being able to turn those outcomes of interest into an evaluation question and funnel that down to specifying what your hypothesis is, the directionality of which way you think the program is going to lead to a change in whatever that outcome is. And then one of the key fundamental elements of choosing an outcome once you've decided whether it be recidivism or it's employment outcomes or it's severity of post-traumatic stress or health outcomes or any of those type of things, you need to then be able to look at the issue of, now that we've chosen the outcome, we have to figure out how we measure that outcome. And measurement is a thing that requires key terminology and concepts that are clearly defined. Right? So when you collect data and try to measure something, you have to be very specific in what data you will and will not be collecting, because you can't go back and recollect once you've started, because you have already started down this process of creating surveys or creating data systems or whatever, and it's very hard to change gears in the middle of that. So you want to spell all that out initially in the beginning. I think it's also important that one of the things that we're primarily going to be focused on here is measurement of outcomes, which is, obviously when we think about our program, we think about our program is going to lead to, again, a positive or negative change in some outcome, right? And we have to be able to measure that. However, one of the things that also can often be forgotten about is that when you do the analysis, you're not just looking at outcomes only, right? Another thing that we'll talk about is this idea of what we'll call exposure, right, to treatment, right, which is measuring this idea here of, right, program or not, right? Because if you think about research design, you're going to have people who participate, right? You're going to have participants, right? But you usually will also sometimes have a control group of non-participants. And one of the things that also has to be measured in some way, shape, or form, right? We usually talk a lot about outcomes, outcome measurement, because things that are outcomes tend to be the most complicated to measure. Specifically, measuring somebody's level of post-traumatic stress, measuring somebody's health outcomes and things like that are very difficult and require a lot more thought, right? In the simplest form, one of the ways that we do this is we assign a dummy variable, right? That we'll say that we have 200 people on our spreadsheet, right? Let's say, if you have a spreadsheet where you might have name, right, person A, person B, person C, person D, right? And we'll call this participation. Right? We're going to measure, yes, they participated, no, they did not, no, they did not, yes, they did, right? So that is a form of measurement where we're also measuring participation in the program, right? There's differences. Let's say this is a counseling program, right? And so we know that individuals B and individual C did not participate in the program, right? We can also put zeros here, right? But if it's a counseling program, we might also collect data on number of hours counseled, right? Let's say this person got 20 hours of services where this person only received 8, right? If you look at, right, this idea of participation, we have a dummy variable, and sometimes this is the best we can do, but we're also we're at least at a minimum able to measure the idea of whether somebody did or did not participate. But what you'll see here is that we have, right, a different measure that is more comprehensive, because we have a lot more variation in between these participants, right? Whereas over here, we only know whether someone did or did not participate. On this side, what we're seeing is that the individual with 20, right, had more than 2 times the exposure to the program as another person. And when we're analyzing that, we don't really want to necessarily treat these same individuals A and D the same in the analysis as we would under, right, the participants category. And when we look at hours counseled, we'd actually get a much more broader picture, right? So looking at this idea of exposure to treatment, how do we measure how much services they received, right? If you're dealing with like a financial support system, you might track total number of dollars that a person received in financial support. It might be number of hours counseled. It might be the number of workshops they received. We deal with medical care. We might look at number of patient visits or appointments kept, right? Because that's trying to replicate how much treatment an individual received by how many appointments they get. And so it's not just the outcome, right? Let's say, if we go back to this idea, right, we may have a number of things, right? So we have your A, B, C, D, right? We have the yes, no, no, yes. We might have our 20, no, no, 8, right? But we still have our outcome of interest where we may measure, let's say it's post-traumatic stress, and we have a measurement scale that runs from 0 to 25, right? With 25 being very bad, and 0 is very good on a post-traumatic stress scale, right? This person at the outcome measure, right, we might also say has a 12, and this person might have a 18. This person, even though they didn't participate, we're using them as a comparison, so we might have a 22 and a 24 here, right? So we have some information there that we're interested in. The other things that you'll also see that are going to come into play, right, when we talk about measurement is also that, right, we have control variables. So we may also need to know things about age, right, and sex. And so we'll call, let's say this is, right, sex is female, right? This person might be a 1 and a 1, both women, a 0 and a 0. And age, we might want to know that they're 34, 22, right, 27, and say 26, right? So here we have, right, what we call the exposure to treatment variables, both here and here, right? Here we have our outcome variable, and here we're dealing with what we call control variables, or independent variables, right, that matter because we know that maybe one's sex, or we may know that one's age potentially also has some impact on the post-traumatic stress outcomes, as well as how much exposure to the treatment they receive, right? And this all becomes important when you think about this, because, right, we're not just talking about measurement from an outcomes perspective. We are, but we also measure this exposure to treatment, right? We also measure these control variables. Oftentimes, they tend to be just demographic characteristics in program evaluation, but they don't always have to be, right? If a person did not participate, one of the questions is how would we be able to measure an outcome? Typically, when we do research and we have a control group and we have these non-participants here, we usually are still asking them to participate in the research or to participate in our study, even though they don't participate in the program. And we'll talk about control groups and how that works later. But the idea is that you may have individuals who sign up for a program. Let's use the hypothetical Long Beach State Nutrition Program again, right? There's plenty of students at the university that don't participate in that program. We might ask them to be in our research study and provide data to us about health outcomes, their weight, exercise activities, etc. Even though they're not participating in our program, the same data we're going to collect, though, we're going to collect of our participants as well. And that's who you're going to compare to try to understand if the program is leading to positive results different than what you might normally observe. And so non-participation doesn't, there's different individuals too. So if you have a program that can only service like 20 individuals at a time and there's a wait list, right, you might actually having non-participants be people on a wait list who did sign up and are actually just a couple months away from starting the program, and you're monitoring the same outcomes for them over that 3 months until they start the program, right? So there's different things. Either way, we'll talk a lot about quantitative measurement here specifically. Qualitative data is a little bit different, so we'll talk about that later in the semester. We're really dealing a lot with quantitative work, right? And this idea of operationalizing your measure, right? Meaning taking the idea, right? If you think about the fact we have an idea, right? This kind of broad concept of something, let's say post-traumatic stress, right? And then operationalizing it into a measure, right? And we'll see another version like this, right? Whereas this is kind of tangible post-traumatic stress that we are measuring based off of questions we might be asking on a survey, right? About how often do you have, you know, episodes where you're unable to function normally due to, you know, nightmares from previous activities or something like that, right? That's a tangible measure that relates to this idea of post-traumatic stress, but we're still operationalizing this broader idea of, well, what are all the different symptoms? What is this condition we're talking about? Right? And what's really important here is this idea that to develop and operationalize good measures, we have to attach numbers to conceptual definitions, right? So this bridge here that says, right, whatever the idea is, we're going to turn it into numbers. Right? How good that bridge is between these two things is really what is going to make an impact on how good our measurement is, right? Because if I asked a question that said on a scale of 1 to 5, tell me how nervous you feel every day, right? And I said, well, that's measuring post-traumatic stress. I'm measuring something. I'm most likely measuring nervousness, right? Nervousness might be a symptom of post-traumatic stress, but so are many other things that I'm ignoring, right? So, right, if we would say that nervousness, let's go here. If we ask the question about nervousness, right, and we're trying to measure nervousness, right, we've done a really good job. If we're talking about nervousness, and we're trying to say that's the same as post-traumatic stress, right, it may not be, right? But we may say that, well, post-traumatic stress does equal, right, nervousness plus, right, anxiety plus sleep disorder plus the possibility of depression, right? We start adding to this thing, we start asking multiple questions to come up with a compound measure, right? Now we may have done a better job, right? So this is tying the idea to the measure well. This is tying the idea to the measure poorly. This would be tying, right, a more complex measure to an idea in a better way. Right. So, for an example, one of the things we talked about, what is the extent of drug use, right? So, extent, if this were a research question, right, this idea of drug use is our outcome that we're going to be trying to measure, right? We have to decide a number of things. However, right, drug use might be our outcome. There's a couple other words in here as well, right, that we'll also have to look at. Right? If you think of each of these as, right, something to measure, right? So when you look at this idea of extent, right, numbers, rates, percentages, right? Well, extent means, usage to some level, right? Level of usage, right? We're talking about level, right? But are we talking about level like number of days, right? Are we talking about the rate relative to the size of the population? How many people do relative to the number of people who possibly could, right? So say like users over all total population, right, to create ourselves a rate, right? So percentages, right, we could use a ratio where we can compute a percentage that is 20% or 50% of the population or users. The idea of drugs, right? This idea in and of itself is something that again needs to be measured, right? Are we counting, right? Are we going to count alcohol and tobacco? Are we counting cigarettes? Are we talking about marijuana? Well, marijuana is legal in some places. So are we now no longer talking about those type of drugs, but only, right, widespread, still nationally illegal things like cocaine and methamphetamines, right? We might be concerned with only opioids because that's a current health epidemic that we're dealing with. And so when we say drug use, well, we don't really mean cocaine. We're talking about opioid related problems, and that's what we care about. So, right, we want to specify these things. Use, again, this is something else that can be considered that needs to be measured, right? So if you think about our last class where we talked about funneling and how we have to get down to, right, a narrow research question, the same is true, right, of measurement, right? We have this idea of an outcome, right, in general, drug use, but we have to specify and we have to funnel it down, right? So we're talking about, maybe we're talking about opioid use specifically. We're talking about illegal opioid use, right? When we talk about use, right, lifetime use, are we talking about the last 30 days? How to define? Right? If we're not counting legal drugs, right, maybe we might mean 90-day period, right? Because research might say that, you know, if somebody has stopped for more than 90 days, we generally would not classify them as having an addiction because they've been able to stop long enough. I don't know if that's true necessarily, right? But if we're saying that greater than 90 days is not necessarily the case, then, you know, this might be a good way to specify so that use, right, is talking about that, right? Usage might be, right, regular, and even that, right, we might want to define as equal to, right, 3 times per week, right? Because, you know, if you've used, I don't know, once in the last 90 days, right? I mean, think about if we were talking about marijuana instead of opioids, for example, right? Well, illegal use might only apply in certain states, right? If we're not talking about opioids, then, you know, one usage in a 90-day period might not really constitute problem usage. We may specifically want to specify and say maybe 3 times a week is problem usage, maybe once daily is problem usage, 5 times per week, right? If we're going to talk about use, you know, somebody who's 37 years old and says they're a marijuana user but used it twice in high school 20 years ago is not the same user as a person who might be 19 and uses it 5 times or more in a 7-day period, right? So we need to be able to define usage because, you know, if we're only going to classify again as like 0 or 1, right, non-user, right, versus user, we need to specify very clearly and say, well, the person, right, who has used marijuana but 20 some odd years ago while they were in high school and has never used it since is different than this person, right? And so we need to measure and be able to delineate, right? When you got a 1, you used illegally, you used within the last 90 days, you used regularly as constituted by at least 3 or more times a week. Right? And again, if we're talking about youth, right, ideally, we wouldn't have asked the older person in this study because we're only targeting youth, but are we targeting anyone under the age of 18, somebody under 16, maybe between 12 and 18 years old? Right? Somebody who is 18 is different than somebody who's under the age of 18, right? So, right, does this mean anybody from age 0 to 17? That could be, you know, when we talk about youth health outcomes, you know, or youth, we'll talk about child mortality, for example. When we say children, we mean anybody 0 to 17. Under the age of 18 is what we would define as a child. Most people may not treat 17-year-olds as a child, but for that definition, we do, right? So you got to be able to be clear on all these different things because every one of those is something, again, that needs to be funneled down and specified so you know what you're measuring. Right? The good news is, if you think about, okay, well, right, what you're really talking about is funneling to the point that you're making a checklist, and so you can say, right, yes, marijuana, right, yes, last 90 days, right, must be 12 to 17 years old, right, must use 3+ times per week, right? Even if we have these 4 basic criterias, right? Basically, what you've said is that somebody to get a 1, right, must have all 4 of these boxes checked. And if they don't have, you know, if they have 3 out of 4, they have 2 out of 4, or they have 1 out of 4, right, they're going to be measured as a 0, right, by our standards, right? So anytime we ask a survey, have you ever used marijuana? Yes, I have. Have you ever used it within the last 90 days? Yes, I have. Right. Are you ages 12 to 17? Yes, I am. Have you used it 3 or more times per week during that 90-day period? No, right? They get to be classified as a non-user by the standard that we set. It's very clear and obvious. And if we say that, yes, I have, right, you meet all 4 criteria we're interested in, we can classify you as yes, right, a user by our definition. Right? And so now we have a clear way of making sure that everybody will fit one of these 2 categories based off these criteria we specified. This is the idea of This is from the textbook where they talk about, it's basically the idea of funneling for measurement, right? So again, right, if you have the idea of, let's say post-traumatic stress, again, for example, right, to be able to funnel, right, we'll take the idea, right, of post-traumatic stress and break it down and try to say, okay, well, what is the sub-elements of it, right? We know that there are some semblance of flashbacks, right? There might be sleep issues, right? We might experience anxiety, right? Higher than normal stress potentially. Right? We might have depression. We could potentially see right, illegal drug use. We might see greater than average legal drug use, right? So over medicating, self-medicating, with taking multiple pills a day when you may not necessarily need to. And so again, you can have this list of different things, right? We've got all these different characteristics we're coming up with for post-traumatic stress, right? And that helps us to funnel it down, because if you think about it, right, if we have anxiety and we have depression, right, let's say flashbacks, we'll say sleep issues, right, and we'll say nervousness. Now that we've specified, right, these 5 major characteristics that we want to specify as part of the idea of post-traumatic stress, right, what we can do is we can create, let's say this is a piece of paper, right? Now what we can do is we can write a survey that we can ask people. What we're going to do, right, this is the post-traumatic stress survey, right, and we might ask question 1A, right, about anxiety. Well, let's call this 1A, 1B, 1C, right? 3 different questions, all that pertain to the idea of anxiety. We've got a 2A and a 2B, right? We've got 2 questions that pertain to depression, right? We've got 3A and 3B, right? Again, different questions, 2 that have to do with sleep issues, and so on and so forth, right? And let's say, just for the sake of this, we've got a 4A and a 5A. Right now, what we've done is we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right, we've got 9 questions total. Right. Let's say these are all multiple choice, and you can choose, A, B, C, or D. Right. What that converts to is that each question out of 9 is worth 4 possible points. Right. Let's say D is the worst possible score, meaning very bad anxiety, very bad depression. Right. A is basically little to no symptoms. Right. What you end up having is a 36-point scale. Right. Anything between 9 and 36 is now this measure of post-traumatic stress that we've created that covers all of what we would deem as the important major elements of post-traumatic stress symptoms, right? And we've got this numerical scale that we can use based off of how everybody answers, right? Question 1A, question 2B, question 1C, right? And so on and so forth, right? And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about this operationalization, is taking all of these ideas so that we can come up with a lot of questions that get to each of the sub-elements. So questions that measure your anxiety, questions that measure your depression, and we can aggregate all that together to make this 36-point scale that's helping to measure how bad somebody's post-traumatic stress is. That make sense? Any questions about that? So there's a good thing in your book that talks about this, that you can see in the measurement chapter, where they break down these sub questions into specific measures, right? So again, if you think about the drug use example from before, right, where we have all these different ideas of extent and drug and use, all of those different questions that make sense to break down further. So measurement accuracy, right? The idea is, right, the hardest part is that when you have an idea of some kind, right, you have to translate this down into, right, a measure, And I mean, think about this as, if you think about having a target, right? And you're shooting an arrow, and you get your little bow here, right, with your arrow. Little stick figure man shooting his arrow. You're going to launch it this direction, right? This target is the broad idea that you're, right? If the target represents the idea that you're trying to hit, when you measure, if you are doing a good job of measurement, you're hitting the bullseye, right? If you hit somewhere out here on the target, right, you're coming close, right? If you think about, again, the post-traumatic stress example, if we're measuring, sleep problems and anxiety, we are nearing the target with regard to what would be post-traumatic stress here in the middle, but we ignored depression, and we ignored flashbacks, and we ignored whatever the other characteristic was, right? And so 3 out of 5 are missing, right? So we didn't necessarily measure like nervousness alone, where we would be way off of what we're trying to target, right? But we did miss some elements. So we're closer to the bullseye, right, than we wanted to be. But the idea is to get as close as we possibly can, right, to where we are, right, the relationship between the measure mirrors the relationship between the concept. Meaning, right, we're hitting the nail on the head. What we have up here as an idea is perfectly reflected to the best extent, possible by measurement standards. The same thing that we're trying to measure. Right? We're not measuring nervousness when we actually are meaning to measure post-traumatic stress. Right? The general problem measurement is precisely the fact all we can observe is the measures, right? So here's the thing, right? If this is your actual post-traumatic stress, right? If I'm the doctor that's treating you, right, I'm actually only able to see, right, whatever this measurement system is. So it's really important to do a good job, because fundamentally, if you've ever known anyone who's been treated for post-traumatic stress, they're going to give them a questionnaire like that puts them on a scale of, right, I mean, you might see something like this, which is like, even as simple as this, right? 1, 2, 3, right? Rate how you feel today, right? For a depression scale, right? Oh, and it looks like you're a 1 out of 3 today, right? That is a measurement system that we could use that tries to put a number to your status. However, right, that's really not the full picture of your depression, because there's a whole lot going in your body that you feel and are aware of, right? But we can't experience that. We, as the outside person, are experiencing where you're scoring yourself, right? And so, as much as, this system here with the 3 faces is a measurement scale, right? If you were a doctor treating somebody, I'm sure you'd much rather have 25 questions that measure a whole bunch of different elements of depression, so that you can have a better idea of, well, you're depressed because you can't get up and do anything, or, okay, well, it looks like you're able to get up and do things for yourself, right? But you have, a tendency for suicidal thoughts, right? But you haven't acted on them, which is a good thing for me, right? But you are not experiencing an interest in doing things you normally enjoy, right? So you get a lot more of a vivid picture than you do with the 3 smiley face situation, right? And that's why, when we're observing these measures, right, we're getting the best picture we can, but not the true picture, because we're only using the measurement itself to make our judgments off of, right? That makes sense? So here's another representation visually of the problem of measurement. Right. This idea is, this right here is going to be our program, typically concept A, right? So again, this is going to be that exposure, right, to treatment thing, where we're trying to measure, right? What we want to measure is the actual program itself, right? And what participating in that program is in actuality, right? And so this is, we'll just say, this is the full counseling program, right? What we're actually measuring is number of counseling hours, right? So when we say, oh, well, this is what happens when you're exposed to our program, what we're saying is, this is what happens when you are exposed to more or less hours of counseling from our service providers, right? Again, our outcome here, it might be post-traumatic stress, right? This is the idea. So again, the theory that we consider this our X variable leads to the Y variable, or this is the outcome, right? The theory says that there's a relationship between these two things, right? Counseling services and post-traumatic stress. levels, right? When we measure, right, this is what we're doing, right? We are putting, right, on paper an operationalized relationship, and what ends up happening is that we're not actually, right, analyzing post-traumatic stress. What we are doing is we're looking at measure of, right, post-traumatic stress, right? So when we actually do our statistics, right, we actually sit down and collect data and everything, we are operating in this world down here where we've collected data and we are presuming that, right, this represents this idea well enough that we can trust it, and this represents that idea well enough that we can trust it, and therefore our concepts are well represented. And the worse and the worse and the worse that our measurement gets, right, the more and the more and the more that we're unable to rely on this analysis, because we're basically not measuring anything close to the idea of, right, counseling services and post-traumatic stress. You know, we're counting number of days you showed up to the office and the impact that that has on your level of nervousness, right, which is far from what we want with regard to the analysis. Any questions about that so far? So there's two key topics that we discuss typically when we're looking at measurement, right? And the first is the idea of reliability, right? If you think about, right, a ruler, right? It's a very bad ruler, right? It's only 5 inches-ish long, right? We use a ruler to measure things, right? And why do they make rulers out of wood, right? Well, from a reliability purpose, right, wood, right, let's say we have a 30-day program, right? And we'll say 1 day and 5 day and 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30, right? If you have to measure how big your hand is from, you know, index finger to pinky, right, and you have to use a wood ruler, and if it's, you know, 4 inches on day one, generally because the wood's not going to warp or change in size or shift on you by some mechanism whatsoever, you're likely going to see that, you know, every few days you measure, right, your 4-inch hand is 4 inches when you measure it, right? That is a reliable instrument, meaning, right, if your hand is actually, right, 4 inches, you should see that every time you get a 4-inch measurement, right? And we trust that wood is reliable because we know it's not going to get any bigger or smaller, basically, every time we use it over and over and over again. So when we use that measure, you know, something 6 inches, something else is 4, we go back to the thing that 4, it should be 4 inches again, right? Measures that are unreliable are things that, right, if this is the actual, right, and this is your measure, right, sometimes you measure something and it's 4 inches and it ends up being 4. And sometimes you measure something that's 4 inches and it's 6. And then another time you do it and it's 5. And another time you do it and it's 4 again. And another time you do it and it's 3 again, right? Your hand never ended up being a different size, but your measure ended up bouncing around because it's unreliable, right? So if you think about that from our last example, you know, you have post-traumatic stress, right? It is a certain level, right? Whatever it is, you know, let's say, you know, this is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, right? You come into our program for treatment services, right? We do this same 25-question survey to measure post-traumatic stress 4 days in a row, right? Again, remember, this is the idea or the concept. Right? We don't have an actual number, but let's say if we did, we knew that you were on a 25-point scale at 21, right, 21, 21, right, and 20, right, because after a couple of days, right, you have a pretty consistent level of post-traumatic stress that goes down a little bit on a Friday because, you know, it's the weekend. Internally, that number is different. An unreliable measure that's only looking at nervousness, for example, or asks, you know, not all, but some of the right questions, but not all of them, right? Where you might see a 25 and a 19 and an 18 and a 23 is what we're actually measuring, right? And we're off by 4 points and 2 points and 3 points, right? And 3. right? And now what we've done is we've introduced this error in terms of the difference between your actual, right, the idea of post-traumatic stress, right, and the measure. And so this unreliability is causing this ongoing problem, right? And because of that, we can't really ever trust that measure because we don't really know, we'll never actually know these numbers, right? Only in this example do we, right? So what we end up having is an inference that you're, oh, well, you're getting a little bit better on day 2 and day 3, but then you got worse again. Well, that's not actually true. It's just symptomatic of our measure being unreliable and bouncing around, right? Same thing if you try to measure your hand with, you know, a stretchy rubber band that had little markers written on it, right? Some days you're going to pull it more or less than others. So you might end up having it be 4 inches one day and 6 the next and 5 the next, etc. Right? That becomes problematic, and that's poor reliability. Right? Validity, on the other hand, right, is this idea we've been talking about, which is, does the measure actually measure what we purport that it should be? Meaning, right, we have, right, an idea, right, and we have a measure, right, and the two of these things, right, pair up very well, right? We're not necessarily broken here where, right, we have a measure, you know, if you think about it here this way, let's say this is, right, this is post-traumatic stress, the idea, right, we want a measure that looks, right, when we try to measure something, we're going to try to draw a measure that's like this, right? The blue circle on top of the red circle means, sorry. If we have these two overlapping, it means that our post-traumatic stress and our measure, right, overlap real well, right? If we end up doing something like this, right, this is our measure, our green measure, measure B, right? We got, if this is our post-traumatic stress and green is our measure, right? We did get overlap here, and so what that means is, well, we have some of the right information in terms of what we're measuring, right? But everything that is in, everything in the overlapping section is correct. However, if we have all of this in yellow, that's basically where we're mismeasuring, or what everything in the yellow area would be is not measured, or is being measured that shouldn't, right? And everything that's in blue would potentially be post-traumatic stress, the idea, that is not represented by our measure, right? So this might be, right, depression that we skipped, and sleep problems, right, and potentially nervousness, right? In red, we might be doing a good job of measuring anxiety, right? And then again, we might be actually measuring inadvertently, let's say hunger, right? And let's say stress or something like that, right? Which are potentially not things related to post-traumatic stress, or let's say we'll call this work stress, right? Which is something people have, but it's not the same as post-traumatic stress type of stress, right? And so we have mismatch. And so, when we want to be doing, like we said before, right? I'll use green again. When we want to measure in blue, we want to target something that covers all of these topics, right? Ignores these other items that we inadvertently don't want to measure, but hits on all of the major parts of post-traumatic stress that we want, right? That's validity, the idea, meaning, right, drawing one circle of measurement directly on top or as close to as possible as we can, right? The other idea. So, I mean, one way you can also think about this too, right? If this is, right, this is the perfect idea, right? In orange, right, we might have really good measurement, and in green, right, we might have not so good measurement, and we have in blue really not so good measurement, and black's not going to show up, but let's say in yellow, right? So we have only a little bit of measurement there, right? We've got better because we have, in the blue, right? And so on and so forth. And so what ends up happening is, you may never be able to perfectly represent post-traumatic stress, right? Everything we do in measurement is an abstraction of an idea that's extremely complicated, so it's never perfect, right? But the further that circle moves from the red circle, right, or basically the idea circle, right, the more and more and further we get away, the worse and worse of a job we're doing measuring, right? And the less and less valid our measure ends up being, because this relationship here between these two things, right, is more and more broken. Right. Here's another kind of version. If you go back to the right, the visualization idea, right? So we have different types of error here, right? So again, we're talking about, right, reliability and validity. So when we look at this, right, if, right, the center circle is always, right, a valid measure, right, what we have here is, right, obviously this is, right, high validity, right, and high reliability, right? Every time we shoot, we hit in the middle. Every time we shoot, every time we shoot in the same space, and every time we shoot the middle of the target, right? Something like this would be high reliability, but low validity, right? We're reliable, and every time we shoot, we get the same spot, except the problem is we're off of our target, and therefore we're not measuring exactly what we want, right? Here, right, let's say you have high validity, but you have validity, right, but you have low reliability because you're hitting the middle of the target on average, but every time you're ending up all over the place because you're doing a little bit of something measured differently every time, right? This is low validity, right, low reliability because, right, your center point is way over here and you're all over the place. So you're not reliable and you're not valid, right, every time you shoot your arrow. That makes sense? Right. So we want something like this where, right, the circle is post-traumatic stress, right? Every time we try to measure, we measure within a very small confine of, right, perfect measurement. And every time we are actually measuring post-traumatic stress, not some other medical condition or some subset of post-traumatic stress that's ignoring important and critical elements that we overlooked. Right. Measurement precision. This is a different topic, but it is pertinent. And this is the idea that using measures that are as precise as possible, and this typically is talking about numerical, so to speak, precision, given the subject that you're studying, right? You don't want to waste information by using imprecise measures, right? So the idea here being that keeping the units of measurement relatively fine. So for an example, let's go back, we'll make another table here. All right, let's say this is person A, person B, and person C, right? And let's say we're trying to measure age for somebody. If we know their age, right, we'll call this in years, right? This person is 23, this person is 34, and this person is 37, right? Precision has to do with the idea that, right, this is probably, right, a precise and very good measurement system, right? If we know that this person is 23 years, 7 months, 28 days old, right? We have become more precise, right? This person will say 34 years, 2 months, 9 days, right? And then this person's 37 years, 9 months, 2 days, right? This is more precise overall, right, than this first one. However, right, it's probably over precise to the point it becomes burdensome, right? Because to ask somebody how old are you on a survey question and make them to fill in the number of years followed by the number of months followed by the number of days and to calculate it, they're probably not going to want to answer in the first place, right? But the sheer fact is that you've become more precise to the point it becomes burdensome, right? If you absolutely had to, however, right? Because you have more precision, right? You can always go this direction, right? Meaning, right? So the idea being that you think about, right? Less precise measures are what we would call aggregated, right? And they work their way down, right, to more precise, right? So in this example, right, if we want to look at age groups, right, and we want to take somebody who is, right, we want to know how many people are 19 to 25, right, and then we want to know 26 to 35, right, 30, right, 35, right, we know that person A fits into this group, person B, let's just say this is 40, right? We want to aggregate to groups. We have 1 and we have 2, right? We're able to aggregate up to this less precise number because using either of these 2 columns, we know exactly how old they are and we can lump them together, right? If we, however, go and we say, are you, right, 19 to 25 or 25 to 40, right? This person is 19 to 25. This person, no, sorry, this should be 26 to 40, right? And this is how we ask the question. We don't ask how many years old are you, right? We ask which of the following best describes you, 19 to 25 years old, 26 to 40 years old, etc. What we're going to get is somebody who says 26 to 40, right? 26 to 40, right? Well, what happens if you ask at this level of precision instead of this first level of precision? Well, all of this information you never collected, right? So you don't actually know exactly how old they are, right? Because you didn't ask them the number of years total. You asked them to answer, right, the age group that they're in. So all you know is this, right? So if I ask you, hey, is person A actually 19 years old, or are they 25 years old, or where are they, right? You don't know because you asked, right, at this less precise level, and therefore can never go back down, right? So the idea here is that, right, if you ask at this most precise level, right, and I would say, if you think about it this way, right, red is asking them how many years old they are, right, knowing that it's very precise but not too precise, right? Green is asking years and days and years and months and days. We know that that's too precise, right, to be useful, right? Orange is asking which tier they're in, right, and it's somewhat precise but not totally aggregated, right? But it becomes right. We can't ever move downward in terms of our directionality, so we can't go this way, right? Once you've aggregated up, and if we ask somebody, right, if they're right between 19 and 39 years old, right? Because then we have 19 to 39, we have 40 to 65, and then we have 65 plus, for example, right? Then what happens? Well, we know everybody's in that tier, right? And now we've aggregated up to this high yellow level, right? And we can never work our way back down again because all we know is that somebody's 19 to 39, and we don't know, right? Because we went back and we even got rid of, right, this specificity and precision, and therefore now all we know is this, right? So you can see as you lose these different blocks, right, you become less and less precise. Right? This doesn't have to do with reliability because we know that right, number of years asking that question is going to be pretty reliable because everyone knows how many years of age they are. We know that it's valid because age typically across the country is measured the same way in terms of number of years, right? But this system is dealing with precision of the measure and how that's problematic, that when you become, right, if you're 19 to 39 years old, that's a valid and reliable measure of how old you are, right? But it is less precise, and therefore what happens is we can no longer go the other direction, right? If I knew that you were 19 years old exactly, I can always aggregate up into groups of 19 to 39-year-olds by just adding everyone into that category, but I cannot go the other way back down. right? And that's why precision becomes so important, right? Because you want to keep distinctions, right, as fine as possible, right, and practical, right? This means that we should not use the years, months, days process because that's not practical, right? But right, number of years, right, is fine and practical, and we can always aggregate up to right to the 19 to 35 or the 19 to 40, right? Or we might do 18 to 65 and then 65 plus only. Right? Any of those groupings we can do because we still have something precise and fine without being impractical. Right. So here's an interesting example from international relations. It's called the Freedom House measure, right? And so the idea is we want to look at how free a country is, right? And typically, if I asked you, is it possible to measure how free a country is? Somebody might say, well, no, of course not. That's extremely complicated. There's no way of being able to know that for sure, right? Well, right, somebody's done some research and they have this theory that, well, how correlated, right, right, so as your freedom, right, amount of freedom goes up, right, we typically see a relationship between high levels of democracy, right? And the same is true that as one goes down a lot, we tend to see individual freedom go down. Right? It's an important question, and it's absolutely something that researchers may want to care about because we care about foreign policy and diplomacy and all these things. Right? So we need to know how free a country is, right? And to be able to measure it. So what happens? Well, they came up with a list of both civil and political rights, right? And on a scale of 1 to 7, they decided that they can say, right, if you have 7, well, this should be right. 1 is right very free, right? You work your way down to 7, which is least free, right? And there are would be 25 total questions measured on this scale, right? We've got 10 of them that are political rights questions, right? So they look at the electoral process. There's a question about how free the electoral process is. Another about political pluralism and participation. This is probably 2. Pluralism, are there multiple parties, right? If you only have one party to vote for in every single election, right, you don't have a lot of freedom necessarily. Participation, meaning people have the opportunity to vote. Anybody or a lot of people can vote. You could do so independently without pressure to choose somebody, right? There's a functioning government of some capacity that is involved in things, right? And they're going to look at right, civil liberties questions, right? So do people have the ability to express themselves freely in their community to their government? Do they have the rights to believe what they want, right? Do you have the ability to organize if you want and to associate with different political organizations? Is there some functioning rule of law in that country? Right? Do you have personal autonomy and individual rights for different types of behaviors and things that you might want to do, right? And they can score all of these on this 1 to 7 scale, right? And so what happens is, if you're thinking about this, you've got right, 1, 2, 3, 4, right, 5, 6, 7, 8, right, 9, 10, right? These might be your political, and then you have your civil, right? 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 15, right? And then for each of these, what you end up having is, right, your scale where you can say, this was a 2, and this is a 3, and this is a 2, and they're really good on, or 7's bad. So they're bad on that one, but they're okay here, great here, right? And so you end up having a 25 question scale that has 7 points possible. And so you have basically any number between 25 and what's that, 175, right? Or I think this is 175 would be right, worst possible country ever because 7 out of 7 on everything, right? And this would be great or very free, right? And therefore we can now score every country and come up with a very right, diverse measure that tends to be pretty reliable about how free a country is, right? And whether or not that is valid, right, is one of those questions where yes, you might be able to argue that there's something outside of those 25 different characteristics that they missed, right? But the important part is that from a researcher's perspective, right, I don't get to just tell them that that's a bad measurement system, right, without being able to say, right, I've got something better to be able to, if I'm going to critique, I need to be able to provide construction feedback that says a way to improve, right? And the sheer fact is something as complicated as how free a country is, right? This is what I would argue a pretty good way of operationalizing that, at least to some extent that we can use it. And it is a thing that, right, it is a measure. It's, I would say, generally pretty reliable by that system. It is something that is pretty valid and maybe not perfect, right? But again, if you want to make the case that, well, this is how free a country is, right, and maybe this is what you're measuring with Freedom House, right, and you're missing this part in red, right? You don't just get to criticize without saying, right, my solution to get you to green is to do X, Y, and Z, right? Because critiquing somebody's method because you think it's not good enough is not the same as providing a practical solution that improves it, and that's really what a researcher has to do. And so, pretty complicated idea that's operationalized in a way that makes it something that's measurable, right? And while it's very complicated, right, this seems to be a pretty good way of doing so. Here's some other examples. This is a question about, have you ever either yes yourself done the following or witnessed something in general, right? And so the idea is this aggression scale. And so what we're trying to do here is determine how likely somebody might be in terms of their aggressive behavior and violence, right? And if you think about this in terms of 1 equals yes to the question and 0 equals no, and they might say, have you ever physically assaulted another person or beaten them up? No, I've never done it myself. No, I've never witnessed it. Have you ever injured another person with a knife? No, I've never done it. No, I've never seen it happen, right? Have you ever made another person scream in pain? No, I haven't. I have seen, right, my father do it to my mother when I was a kid, right? And yes, I've accidentally hit somebody and made them bleed. And yes, I've seen it happen, right? And what happens is you start going through this whole process, right, to answer all these questions, right? And now what we have is 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right, 9, right? We come up with a number that is the measure of how aggressive we are likely to be as a person based off of all of these 17 different characteristics, right? So out of a possible 34 points, right, you could potentially get 0 to 34, right, to being very aggressive, right, to not at all. And that's the way that we can measure, right, how aggressive somebody is, because we know that if they do any of these things, they're an aggressive person or prone to violence. If they've witnessed it, meaning they've seen it as a child or they've experienced it in their life, someone else doing it around them, that also put them at greater risk. And therefore, we now have this quantitative system that addresses all these different complicated things that are part of aggressive behavior, right? Here's another one here. This is looking at driving behavior. And so what you'll see is that there's 3 different types of driving behavior. So there's anxiety, right, anxious drivers, right, over exaggerated safety, right? So this is sometimes reacting, right? Being too cautious or too scared, right? And then this is hostile or aggressive. So each of these is a different type of driving. You might be 1 or 2 or 3. You could be all of them or you could be none, right? What they've identified is that numbers, right? So item 1 and 4, right? So 5, right? 6, say 9, 14, and 21. Let's go with blue, right? If blue is exaggerated, right? Question 3 asks about exaggerated driving. 8 does, 11 does, 12, 13, 16, and 19, right? And then in orange, right, hostile aggressive behaviors, right, are the rest of these. So what happens is we're actually doing one measurement system that addresses 3 different types of driving questions, but then what we can do is we can come in and say, Okay, I lose track of where I'm going when I drive. Yes, frequently that happens to me. I yell at the driver who makes me nervous. I typically am very calm and I very infrequently will yell. Right. Yes, I like to slow down at intersections because I feel like, you know, even at the light screen, I'm worried. I don't have trouble staying in the correct lane. I don't just typically drift into other lanes. Right. And then, right, so we go through this same process again where somebody can get scored on all these different things. Right. Let's see, I don't do any of these. Right. Now what happens is because we used one instrument, we can go through and say, right, 2 plus 3, right, plus 3 plus 2 and a 2 and a 2 and a, let's say this is a 3. Then we add all those numbers up, right? And now we can get our number for how hostile of a driver you are, right? And if we go back to this, right, we can use our blue numbers to figure out, right, the score we have on our exaggerated safety, right, and so on and so forth. And so we come up with potentially, right, if you add all of these numbers up, you have a total measure of how potentially bad of a driver you are, or how dangerous of a driver you are, right? But we can also have this scale that looks at, well, you're not overall total a bad driver, but you are over exaggerating or overly cautious, right? And so that is kind of your risk area, because on those you know, blue questions, specifically on our measurement scale, you are scoring higher, right, than on some of the others, right? So we're not worried that you're hostile, we're not worried that you're anxious, we are worried that you're over precautious, and that becomes something that maybe you need to correct, maybe you need to be concerned of, or at least aware of when driving, that you do those things, right? And that puts you at some risk of an accident, even though, right, it's actually the fault of being over precautious, as opposed to being, right, just a hostile and aggressive road rage type of a person, right? Or maybe you have both of these things, right, because you're, you know, very angry yet extremely safe driver or something like that, right? So you can get multiple ideas put together into a particular matrix, right? Here's another thing, example, trying to measure how often somebody eats, how, you know, something about their diet. So how many pieces of raw fruit do you eat a week, right? Obviously, right, never is bad. We want more than once a day, right? Higher number being good. How often on average do you eat a serving of fruit, including fresh, tinned, or frozen? Again, right, more being better. Here we want yes is better than no. What kind of fresh fruit did you eat yesterday? Right, this is maybe a little more descriptive. Right, doesn't really matter the size of the fruit, right? But this is kind of checking their, you know, description, right? Do you know what type of fruit it was? How much did you eat? Right, this we could use a similar scale if we wanted to, that had, right, how much, all of it, some of it, none of it, you know, a bite, whatever, right? And then you know, fruit juice, right? We want more than usual, so to speak, right? So again, we're trying to measure, right, fruit consumption. So if we're looking at dietary questions, and we may need to ask other questions about vegetables and other questions about, you know, sugary, fatty foods, but we can use this system to be able to overall get an idea of, right, the complexity of somebody's diet with regard to fruit consumption. Are there any questions about measurement at all? Reliability, validity, precision, anything we talked about, how that works? Let's see any questions. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull up again the discussion post for next week so that you can see the activity that you're gonna have. So you should have all by now done your discussion board posts, where you're going to have to write down your research question and hypothesis. And I think you would have done probably 2 research questions, but for any of those, you'll have chosen outcomes that are specific to your program. And so now what you're going to do is turn the discussion towards looking at those outcomes that you've picked, right, and being able to tackle the question of measurement for that outcome. So Hopefully you can see this. Try to zoom on a little for you. Right, so what you're going to do for this is take one of the research questions and hypothesis that you've created. So just of the two questions, choose one. I don't care which, whichever one makes sense for you at this point, and then develop one for each outcome. So for the one outcome specific to that one research question, come up with a way to operationalize the concept. So, if you have a research question, again, looking at, will the program lead to a reduction in post-traumatic stress, right? Come up with an example operationalization. And one way of measuring this for healthy eating is to ask questions about number of calories consumed over a 14-day period, with highest levels of calories indicating less healthy, right? So this is 2 examples. I don't expect you to do 2. I want you to come up with 1, right? So this is an example. If I have a 10-question survey with everybody having a 0 to 40 scale, right? And they can ask questions like, how many times during a week do you eat fast food like McDonald's, Taco Bell, and that burger? Right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or more, right? So 4 here representing higher score and worse off on our 0 to 40 scale, right? So something like that will elaborate on how you will operationalize and measure the outcome specifically that you have for that research question. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? What you're trying to do there? Okay.